It began on a rainless night over Lisbon, June 3, 1944. The sky was silent except for the low growl of a twin-engine plane skimming the dark Atlantic air. Its fuselage shimmered under the faint light of a waxing moon. Inside, a man sat alone, hands trembling over a brown leather case chained to his wrist. His name was Hans Ritter, at least that was the name printed on the forged papers in his coat. The documents inside the case were marked with the seal of the Reich's Abwehr intelligence service. Ritter believed he carried the most critical assessment of the American military ever produced. In truth, every page inside that briefcase was a carefully constructed lie, handwritten by the very enemy he thought he was defeating. As the plane descended through fog, the pilot muttered coordinates under his breath. Lisbon lay ahead, the last neutral port in a world at war. Its lights shimmered like faint embers on the edge of darkness. When the wheels touched the runway, a British observer at the far end of the field lifted his binoculars. Moments later, a coded transmission pulsed through the static. The package breathes. Thousands of miles away, inside a dim OSS outpost in Bern, Switzerland, an American officer received the message, exhaled slowly, and whispered to his partner, "He's taken the bait." That whisper marked the silent heartbeat of a larger operation, one that would help shape the fate of D-Day before the first soldier ever set foot on the beaches of Normandy. History remembers the gunfire, the invasion, the triumph. What it often forgets is the invisible war that made it possible. The war fought with words, forged signatures, and the fragile trust of men who believed lies disguised as truth. If you want to understand how the United States learned to weaponize deception, how a handful of analysts and field operatives outwitted the most formidable intelligence network in Europe, and how one false report manipulated the mind of Adolf Hitler himself, stay with this story. And if you haven't yet subscribed, do it now, because what follows isn't history as you know it. It's the secret history that was never meant to be told. By 1943, the Office of Strategic Services, known simply as the OSS, was still a new creation. Born from the chaos of Pearl Harbor, it was America's desperate response to a global intelligence war it had entered too late. Britain had MI5 and the double-cross system, masters of turning captured agents into conduits of disinformation. Germany's Abwehr had infiltrated half of Europe, its tentacles reaching from Madrid to Stockholm. Japan's Kempeitai terrorized Asia with ruthless efficiency. And America had nothing but fragments, military attaches, scattered analysts, and a few academics pretending to be spies. That changed when President Roosevelt appointed General William Wild Bill Donovan to forge order from chaos. Donovan believed that victory in modern war depended not on firepower but on perception, on the ability to make your enemy see what you wanted him to see. The OSS was built not as a mirror of the military but as its ghost. It moved in silence, struck with rumors, and left no footprints. Its currency was fiction, and its battlefield was the mind. The man who would become its most unwilling weapon, Hans Ritter, began his career as a clerk in Berlin's Ministry of Supply. He was efficient, loyal, and unremarkable, precisely the kind of man the Abwehr preferred. But Ritter's ambition burned brighter than his talent. When the war began, he volunteered for foreign service, hoping to become the eyes of Germany abroad. Instead, he became the eyes that would be blinded. The OSS first noticed him in late 1943 through intercepted cables between German informants in Madrid and Lisbon. Ritter had been assigned as an observer, tasked with gathering information on Allied shipping and industrial production. His arrogance made him careless. He boasted of contacts inside the American war machine, of secret channels that could reveal the true scale of U.S. logistics. What he didn't realize was that those contacts were already part of a network designed by the OSS. Through a delicate web of double agents and fabricated leaks, the Americans began feeding Ritter small pieces of truth, shipment numbers, factory names, troop movements. Each was accurate enough to earn his trust but misleading enough to plant the first seeds of deception. Ritter believed he was cultivating his own network of spies. In reality, he was being handled like a marionette by an organization that had rewritten the rules of intelligence. Inside OSS headquarters in Washington, the project was codenamed Phantom Circuit. The goal was simple but revolutionary: create an entirely false picture of American military capability and make the Germans believe it was their own discovery. Every report Ritter sent to Berlin passed through the invisible hands of the OSS. His courier in Lisbon was not a German sympathizer but a paid operative of the Allies. His encoded messages were corrected by cryptographers in Bern who retyped them on carbon paper to match Ritter's style. The forgeries were perfect, same ink, same rhythm, same errors. The illusion was total. Berlin received a stream of intelligence so consistent, so plausible, that no one dared question its authenticity. Ritter's name began to circulate among Abwehr circles as a model of precision. He was promoted, praised, and unknowingly became a pillar in Hitler's perception of American might. His reports claimed that the United States could field over 120 armored divisions by 1945, that its aircraft factories were producing 4,000 bombers a month, that fuel reserves in the Midwest could sustain an invasion of Europe for years. Every figure was wrong, but wrong in the exact way that made the Reich feel safe. As the months passed, the OSS refined its theater of deception. They built a parallel world, a synthetic America that existed only on paper. Typists in Washington produced fake factory manifests by the hundreds. Engineers drew blueprints of non-existent tanks. Radio operators simulated chatter from phantom airfields. Cryptographers inserted references to imaginary regiments into intercepted German communications, knowing they would be mirrored back through Ritter's own channels. The Germans were not just reading American lies, they were echoing them. And at the center of it all was one man in a Lisbon cafe, believing he was saving his country. In April 1944, as the Allies finalized plans for Operation Overlord, the OSS saw an opportunity. Britain's MI5 had already perfected the art of large-scale deception with Operation Fortitude, convincing German command that the invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy. The Americans decided to complement that effort with economic disinformation, statistics and logistical projections that would make the Calais scenario appear not only logical but inevitable. Ritter's false intelligence became the perfect vessel. Through his network, the OSS delivered a falsified assessment of American industrial logistics, production schedules, transport timetables, fuel allocations. It suggested that the bulk of Allied armor and supply ships were stationed in southern England, directly across from Calais. Ritter transmitted it faithfully, unaware that the entire package had been crafted by men in Washington who never left their desks. Berlin's analysts integrated his data into their own invasion forecasts. By late May, the High Command was convinced that Normandy was a feint. In a small safe house near Bern, an OSS officer named James Donovan recorded his final field entry before D-Day. June 1, 1944. Subject maintains total confidence in his sources. Phantom circuit functioning as intended. Berlin expects northern assault. Washington satisfied. Operation nearing completion. Donovan's handwriting was neat, deliberate. He paused for a moment before adding a final line. History will not remember this name. But perhaps it should. He burned the page in an ashtray and watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling, a silent echo of every lie he'd told. Ritter, meanwhile, celebrated his success with a glass of brandy in Lisbon's Hotel Avish. He had no idea that across the Atlantic, in a locked office at 2430 E Street, analysts were monitoring every cipher he sent. His messages were intercepted, decoded, and re-encrypted before reaching Berlin. To the OSS, his pride was the most efficient weapon they'd ever built. One analyst later wrote in his post-war notes, "He thought he was deceiving us. In truth, he deceived himself first." On the night of June 5, as storm clouds rolled over the English Channel, a message flashed through the Abwehr's network. Confirm imminent invasion in northern France. Reinforcements to Calais approved. It was the confirmation the Allies had prayed for. The next morning, as the first waves of landing craft struck the beaches of Normandy, entire German divisions waited hundreds of miles away, guarding a coastline that would never be attacked. In Washington, Donovan received the signal from London. Subject transmission received by OKW at 2300 hours. Deception complete. He folded the paper slowly, looked at his assistant, and said, "That's how you win a war without firing a shot." For the OSS, the operation was an awakening. They had proven that information, not fire, could shape history. Ritter's file was quietly sealed and archived with a single word stamped across the cover: success. He was recalled to Berlin weeks later, interrogated, then reassigned to a desk job in Prague. He lived out the rest of his days never realizing he had been the instrument of his own nation's undoing. And yet, in a way, his failure became America's foundation. From the ashes of the OSS would rise the Central Intelligence Agency, an organization built on the lessons of that invisible war. Ritter's lies taught them that truth in warfare was no longer absolute. It was pliable, fragile, and deadly when properly shaped. So when historians talk about the great battles of World War II, they speak of Normandy, of Ardennes, of Berlin. But in the shadows between those battles lies another kind of victory, the kind that leaves no graves, no medals, only silence. It began with one man, one false report, and an empire of deception that turned belief itself into a weapon. That was the legacy of the OSS. And that was the night the world learned that the sharpest blade in war is not forged from steel, but from trust. In Washington, the night after D-Day broke across the world's radios, the headquarters of the Office of Strategic Services remained dim and quiet. No champagne, no cheers, just the faint scratching of typewriters and the smell of hot ink. The victory that mattered most had already taken place, long before the first wave hit the sand. It had unfolded inside rooms like these, filled with maps, cables, and exhausted minds who had spent months sculpting the enemy's perception of truth. The men and women who worked here called themselves analysts, technicians, translators, but in truth they were illusionists. They had just pulled off one of the most extraordinary deceptions in modern history, and almost no one outside those walls would ever know their names. The OSS had learned early that deception required more than information. It required structure, an entire machinery designed to breathe life into lies. At the top stood General William Donovan, Wild Bill, a man who looked less like a spy chief and more like a banker, always in tailored suits, his eyes sharp, his voice calm. He had an almost philosophical obsession with intelligence, once saying that a rumor in the right ear can move an army farther than any general's order. He surrounded himself with people who thought like novelists, not soldiers. Professors, journalists, cryptographers, actors, linguists. Many had never fired a gun. But they could craft stories that could collapse empires. Under Donovan's vision, the OSS built a web of interlocking units. Research and analysis gathered fragments of intercepted intelligence and turned them into patterns. X2, the counterintelligence branch, hunted enemy agents and, when possible, recycled them as double-cross assets. Morale operations focused on psychological warfare, leaflets, fake broadcasts, disinformation planted in enemy newspapers. Each branch was a cog in the greater machine, turning unseen beneath the surface of the war. The deception that trapped Hans Ritter had emerged from this system. It wasn't one man's invention, but the product of hundreds of minds weaving a consistent illusion, every lie supported by a dozen smaller truths. The OSS learned to create authenticity through detail. A single false document might fail, but a stack of them, each echoing the same lie, became irresistible. It was statistical hypnosis. In a locked room at 2430 E Street, teams of typists replicated German military formats down to the last comma. The ink came from the same suppliers used in Berlin. The paper was imported through neutral Switzerland to ensure perfect weight and texture. German spelling errors were studied, catalogued, and intentionally repeated. Nothing was improvised. Every detail existed to seduce the enemy's sense of realism, to make the unreal feel inevitable. Behind every operation there was also a storyteller, someone responsible for shaping the emotional rhythm of the lie. In the case of Phantom Circuit, that storyteller was a woman named Eleanor Chase. A cryptographer by trade, she had been a journalist before the war, a writer who understood how people believed, not just what they read. She never met Hans Ritter, but she knew him intimately through his reports. She studied his word choice, his syntax, his need for validation. "He wants to be seen," she wrote in one internal memo. "So show him himself, only larger." Her insight became the cornerstone of the deception. The OSS didn't simply feed Ritter data, they fed him identity. They built a fantasy where he was indispensable, a man whose reports reached Hitler's desk. The more he believed in that version of himself, the less he questioned the information he received. It was Chase who suggested introducing deliberate inconsistencies into Ritter's reports. Not mistakes, but human touches. A wrong digit here, a misused abbreviation there, imperfections that made the lies feel alive. "Flawless things are suspicious," she once told her team. "Real people make small mistakes. Give him the mistakes and he'll trust the rest." The strategy worked so well that even the Germans' internal reviewers defended Ritter's accuracy. They saw in his flaws the proof of authenticity. Meanwhile, in Europe, OSS operatives worked tirelessly to sustain the illusion's ecosystem. In Lisbon, fake shipping manifests circulated through neutral trade offices. In Madrid, OSS-funded businessmen discussed American convoy routes over dinner loud enough for German agents to overhear. In Stockholm, coded telegrams hinted at a massive buildup of Allied armor opposite Calais. Each piece was a droplet feeding the same river of deceit that Ritter unknowingly carried to Berlin. The brilliance of the operation was that none of these pieces seemed coordinated. They looked like random noise, but when assembled by the Abwehr they formed a coherent, convincing pattern. The OSS had weaponized the enemy's own logic. Inside the OSS training manuals, a single line summed up the philosophy: control the frame and the picture paints itself. The Germans believed they were assembling a mosaic of truth. In reality, they were completing a puzzle designed by their enemy. But deception came at a cost. Every operative in this shadow world carried the burden of uncertainty, of living within lies so complex they began to feel like reality. James Donovan, the field handler in Bern, wrote in his final letter to headquarters, "We are becoming the stories we invent. If this is the price of victory, may history forgive us." His tone was weary, stripped of triumph. For every successful operation, there were a dozen that collapsed in silence. Agents captured, couriers exposed, networks burned by a single misplaced word. Yet the machine kept moving, indifferent to the human weight it carried. By mid-1944, Phantom Circuit had expanded beyond Ritter. Similar operations bloomed across Europe. Fabricated economic studies in neutral banks, counterfeit reports sold on the black market, intercepted messages leaked intentionally to German embassies. It wasn't enough to fool one spy. The goal was to reshape an entire system's perception of the world. Berlin's analysts, overwhelmed by data, relied on consistency to filter truth from rumor. The OSS understood that principle and inverted it. They created consistency out of lies. To the human mind, repetition equals reliability. And in the noise of war, reliability becomes gospel. One of the most fascinating aspects of the OSS deception program was its collaboration with Hollywood. In early 1944, studios were quietly approached to design realistic photographs, props, and even miniature models of military equipment that didn't exist. These images were then accidentally captured by German agents or planted in neutral press agencies. The result was a visual mythology of American might, a phantom army of ships, aircraft, and machines that existed only in celluloid and imagination. Ritter's intelligence reports cited these same images as verification of his own claims. The circle was perfect. The lie had begun to feed itself. While the OSS was building illusions abroad, its leaders understood that the ultimate test would come not in Europe but in the aftermath of victory. Deception, once unleashed, had a habit of surviving its purpose. Donovan feared that his creation might one day turn inward, that the ability to shape truth could become addictive. He ordered strict compartmentalization. No agent was ever allowed to know the full scope of an operation. Files were burned weekly. Codenames replaced identities. Even within the agency, truth became a scarce commodity. Back in Lisbon, Ritter's health began to decline. He drank too much, slept too little, and became paranoid that someone was following him. He was right, but the men tailing him weren't assassins. They were OSS operatives assigned to protect the illusion from collapsing. Ritter's mental unraveling was dangerous. A frightened spy talks too much. Donovan ordered his handlers to stabilize him through controlled praise, letters from Berlin confirming his excellent work, small deposits of Reichsmarks into his accounts, even a congratulatory telegram allegedly signed by Admiral Canaris himself. The OSS wrote that telegram. Ritter never questioned it. By June's end, the operation had exceeded its goals. The German High Command was drowning in false assessments. They diverted reconnaissance flights, reassigned divisions, and misallocated fuel reserves. The Wehrmacht's logistical chaos in the summer of 1944 was not merely a consequence of battlefield loss. It was the ghostly echo of Phantom Circuit, reverberating through every level of their command chain. The Germans had been convinced that America's industrial capacity was near limitless, that even a failed invasion could be followed by another within weeks. That illusion bred hesitation. And hesitation in war is fatal. When the war ended less than a year later, the OSS dissolved quietly into the bureaucracy of peace. Its files were sealed, its agents scattered. Hans Ritter was never prosecuted. He returned to Berlin, a city of ruins, and lived in anonymity. The few who remembered him spoke of a man broken by confusion, haunted by the realization that his greatest work had served his enemies. He died in 1951 alone, his name absent from history books. Yet somewhere in an American archive his file remained intact, a relic of a time when fiction altered the fate of nations. The machinery that had orchestrated his downfall didn't vanish. It evolved. The OSS became the CIA. Its doctrines of psychological warfare matured into global strategy. Propaganda became diplomacy. Information became power. And beneath the surface of the post-war world, the same logic persisted. Control the frame and the picture paints itself. The story of Phantom Circuit is not only a tale of wartime cunning. It is a warning. It shows how easily truth can be engineered, how men of good faith can be guided into betraying their own cause without ever realizing it. In the darkness of that invisible war, the boundaries between fact and fiction dissolved until even the victors questioned their reflection. Donovan once said, "The secret of intelligence is not knowing everything, it's knowing what to believe." After 1944, belief itself became the new battleground. And in that shadow the OSS learned their most enduring lesson, that in the age of total war the most powerful weapon was not the bomb, nor the bullet, nor the army, but the story. After Normandy the OSS didn't celebrate. Their victory existed in silence, written only in classified reports stamped with the word completed. Yet within that silence grew something larger than war, a new kind of power, one that could reshape perception itself. The lesson of Phantom Circuit had changed them. If lies could move divisions, if belief could alter the trajectory of history, then truth was no longer sacred. It was strategic. The men who had crafted the deception around Hans Ritter now found themselves architects of a new doctrine: narrative warfare. In the months that followed D-Day, as the Allies advanced through France, the OSS turned its machinery toward broader targets. The deception was no longer confined to a single agent or a single front. It became systemic. Every enemy intercept, every rumor, every headline was a potential weapon. Inside the psychological warfare branch, analysts began mapping what they called the web, a diagram showing how rumors traveled across Europe like veins beneath a body. Information moved faster than armies, through diplomats, merchants, priests, and prisoners. The OSS realized that controlling these veins meant controlling the bloodstream of reality itself. They created fake shortages in German-occupied territories by leaking forged shipping manifests to black market dealers. They spread stories of mutinies within German ranks through intercepted radio chatter. They planted letters from fictitious officers describing the hopelessness of the Eastern Front. Every fragment had a purpose. Together, they painted a portrait of inevitable German collapse long before the guns fell silent. For the first time in modern history, words replaced bullets as the preferred tool of domination. The operation's success drew the attention of allies and rivals alike. British intelligence, already masters of disinformation, began coordinating directly with their American counterparts. Soviet agents in Switzerland took notes, recognizing the potential for such techniques beyond the battlefield. In Washington, the OSS experiments caught the eye of political strategists who saw in it not just a wartime tool, but the foundation of post-war influence. The philosophy behind it was simple but chilling. Control perception and you control behavior. Eleanor Chase, the cryptographer who had engineered much of Phantom Circuit, wrote an internal essay for Donovan titled The Elastic Truth. In it, she argued that truth is not the opposite of deception, but its product. She explained that the human mind does not seek reality, it seeks coherence. When a story feels consistent, we accept it even if it's false. The perfect lie, she wrote, is the one that remains true long after it's been exposed. Her paper circulated quietly among senior officers, its tone almost prophetic. Many found it disturbing. A few called it genius. Donovan marked the first page with a single line in pencil: "Keep her close." While Europe burned, the OSS looked east. Japan's intelligence networks were proving resilient, disciplined, and almost fanatically loyal. Direct infiltration was nearly impossible. So the OSS adapted the same techniques they had tested in Europe, creating illusions not through individuals, but through systems. They fabricated entire companies in neutral Asian ports that appeared to supply Japanese forces. They generated fake shipping records showing non-existent raw materials flowing to enemy factories. Each fabrication triggered real responses. Japanese agents chased phantom suppliers, military planners adjusted logistics to accommodate phantom resources. Deception became a self-sustaining ecosystem. To the OSS, this was an awakening. They were no longer merely observing the war, they were scripting it. Their lies didn't just report reality, they shaped it. When agents in China intercepted Japanese orders based on non-existent shipments, Donovan allegedly remarked, "We're not feeding them fiction anymore. We're writing their future." But beneath the triumph lay unease. The psychological cost of this new warfare was profound. Agents lived surrounded by the worlds they had invented, never certain which parts of their work were real. Field operatives who had managed multiple false identities began suffering from breakdowns. Some forgot which name was theirs. A few defected, unable to reconcile the person they were with the lies they had told. One OSS psychologist warned in a 1945 memo that our own minds are beginning to mirror the illusions we manufacture. The war was ending, but the machinery of deception had grown too valuable to dismantle. In April 1945, with Berlin collapsing, OSS officers began preparing for what came next. They drafted plans to merge psychological operations into peacetime intelligence. The concept was controversial. Many inside the military wanted the deception units disbanded. But Donovan argued that in a post-war world, control of information would be the new frontier. The enemy would no longer be a nation, it would be confusion. He was right. By the time the OSS officially dissolved in October 1945, its fragments had already been absorbed into a new organism. The Central Intelligence Group and later the CIA inherited not only its personnel but its philosophy. The tools that had fooled the Reich would now serve the Republic. Propaganda became policy. Disinformation became diplomacy. The line between truth and strategy blurred, perhaps forever. For those who had lived through the original deception, it was a quiet tragedy. Eleanor Chase left government service in 1946, retreating to a small cabin in Vermont. In her personal journal, she wrote, "We thought we were fighting monsters. Then one day we realized the monsters were ideas." Her notes, found decades later, described her fear that the techniques she had pioneered would one day be used not against enemies abroad, but against citizens at home. "The lie," she wrote, "is patient. It waits for new masters." In the archives of the OSS, now declassified, a memorandum from 1945 summarizes phantom circuits' impact in cold bureaucratic language. Objective achieved. Strategic value, confirmed. Psychological potential, unlimited. To the men who wrote those words, it was a success story. To history, it was the birth certificate of the modern information age. The echoes of that deception extended far beyond Europe. During the early months of the Cold War, Soviet intelligence reviewed captured German archives and discovered Ritter's reports. The KGB analysts who examined them recognized the fingerprints of OSS manipulation. They were both impressed and alarmed. Soviet officer Pavel Sudoplatov later wrote, "The Americans have learned the ancient secret of empire, not to conquer minds but to guide them." From that moment, an invisible arms race began, not of weapons but of narratives. The lesson of the OSS spread across the globe. Nations began building their own psychological operations divisions. The British called it perception management. The Soviets coined the term aktivnaya meropryatsia, active measures. The Americans, more careful with language, preferred strategic communication. But beneath the euphemisms, the essence remained the same: a war fought in the imagination. Back in Lisbon, the city where Phantom Circuit had begun, the war's ghosts lingered. The old cafes still echoed with languages from a vanished world: German, English, Portuguese, coded murmurs that once decided the fate of continents. Locals told stories of a man who used to sit alone in the corner of Café Chiato, scribbling notes on yellow paper, chain-smoking, muttering to himself about false factories and numbers that never were. They said he paid for his coffee in Reichsmarks years after the currency had died. Some claimed he was mad. Others said he was haunted. His name, of course, was Hans Ritter. No one in Lisbon knew who he had been, or what part he'd played in the war. But in Washington, his name remained buried in the archives, a symbol not of failure but of mastery. Ritter was the proof that deception could become indistinguishable from truth if told well enough. The more the OSS studied the aftermath of Phantom Circuit, the clearer their conclusion became: the most efficient deception is the one that no longer needs a deceiver. When the lie becomes self-sustaining, When people repeat it, defend it, believe it without prompting, it ceases to be false. It becomes history. That was the true brilliance of Operation Phantom Circuit. The OSS had discovered that you didn't need to win wars, you only needed to win belief. By the end of 1945, a new phrase began circulating within the remnants of the agency: the truth is what survives the lie. It was written on chalkboards during briefings, muttered in the corridors of the State Department, scribbled on the backs of cigarette packets by men who had seen too much. It became a kind of gospel for the emerging intelligence world. They had crossed a line and there was no going back. By 1946, the war had ended, but the silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. Europe lay in ruins and America stood unscathed, powerful, confident, and quietly haunted. The OSS had dissolved, but its spirit lingered in corridors that now belonged to the Central Intelligence Agency. The machinery of deception had not stopped. It had simply changed uniforms. In the cold offices of Washington, the men who once crafted illusions for war were now being asked to do the same for peace. The same rooms that had once built Ritter's phantom intelligence reports were now tasked with shaping the narratives of reconstruction, democracy, and freedom. Their tools were identical: rumors, forgeries, and psychological manipulation, but their targets were new. No longer soldiers in gray uniforms but entire populations. Eleanor Chase returned briefly as a consultant. She found her old office unrecognizable, brighter, noisier, full of men who spoke in the clipped jargon of bureaucracy. The walls were covered with maps not of Europe, but of ideas. Influence zones, radio frequencies, propaganda networks. The war had ended, but the battle for belief had expanded. One young analyst greeted her with enthusiasm, saying, "Your work laid the foundation for all of this." She smiled politely but didn't answer. In her diary that night she wrote, "We've won a war against lies by turning truth into strategy. I can't tell whether we liberated the world or infected it." The CIA absorbed everything the OSS had learned and made it policy. Operation Mockingbird began quietly in 1948, an effort to influence global journalism, ensuring that America's story reached the world first and loudest. Films, newspapers, radio, all became instruments of national persuasion. It was the natural evolution of Phantom Circuit. Where Ritter once transmitted false reports to Berlin, editors now transmitted crafted truths to every corner of the earth. The difference was scale. The lie had become institutionalized. In this new era, intelligence officers weren't just collecting information, they were shaping reality itself. For them, the boundaries between truth and illusion had dissolved entirely. If the public believes it, one internal memo read, then it's operationally true. James Donovan, the field handler who had orchestrated Ritter's deception, watched these developments from afar. He had left the agency after the war, returning to law. Yet the ghosts of the past followed him. In 1949, he was called before a Senate committee to testify about the OSS wartime methods. The senators, polite but wary, asked whether psychological warfare had crossed ethical boundaries. Donovan paused for a long time before answering. "Senator," he said finally, "we built weapons from words. And once you build them, you can't put them back in the box." His testimony was redacted, archived, and forgotten. But his words would echo for decades. Eleanor Chase's fears were realized sooner than anyone expected. In 1950, at the dawn of the Cold War, both superpowers began deploying psychological operations against one another. The Soviet Union perfected propaganda as ideology, the United States refined it as policy. Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, Pravda, Izvestia, all became frontlines in a new invisible conflict. The war for truth had replaced the war for territory. Inside the CIA, veterans of the OSS referred to this as the Second Shadow War. Its weapons were quieter, but its casualties were real. In countries across Europe and Asia, elections were swayed, revolutions ignited, and governments toppled, all through the manipulation of narrative. The ghosts of Operation Phantom Circuit haunted every broadcast, every rumor, every newspaper column that carried the fingerprints of unseen hands. And then came the turning point, the moment when the machine began to devour its creators. In 1952, an internal audit within the CIA uncovered a curious pattern: fabricated intelligence reports circulating within their own system. Phantom data, made-up sources, falsified field notes, even forged memos, had begun to move through official channels. Some were created deliberately to protect real agents. Others were accidents born from bureaucratic confusion. But soon no one could tell the difference. Lies, once meant for enemies, were now contaminating the agency itself. Analysts started doubting their own briefings. One report claimed that Soviet bombers had been sighted in Alaska, a fabrication. Another insisted that an uprising had begun in East Berlin, a distortion. Decision-makers acted on them anyway. Reality and fiction were merging into a single operational truth. An internal memo written by Chase in late 1952 captured the horror succinctly: "We built the perfect deception engine. It doesn't need an operator anymore." That was the climax, the moment when the architects of manipulation realized they had lost control. The same techniques that had fooled the Nazis were now fooling their own masters. Donovan, now retired, visited Eleanor one winter evening in Vermont. They sat by a wood stove, surrounded by piles of yellowed papers and the smell of smoke. She asked him quietly, "Do you ever think about him, Ritter?" Donovan nodded. "Every day." She stared into the fire and said, "We used him to win a war. But what if we used the war to create more Ritters?" Donovan didn't answer. Outside, the snow fell softly, erasing every footprint leading up to her cabin. By the mid-1950s, the OSS legacy had spread into every corner of American intelligence. The art of deception had matured into doctrine. Governments no longer asked whether something was true, they asked whether it was useful. Propaganda merged with policy, secrecy with statecraft. The intelligence community had become the invisible spine of a new empire, not defined by territory but by perception. But every empire carries its own decay within it. The agents who once crafted lies for national security began to see the corrosion of trust everywhere. Journalists questioned nothing. Citizens believed everything. Political leaders quoted facts that no one could trace to a source. The architects of deception watched the world they'd created unfold with a kind of grim fascination. They had built a machine that no longer distinguished between creation and consumption. In 1954, Eleanor Chase was hospitalized for exhaustion. In her medical records, a doctor noted her recurring nightmares, dreams of typewriters clicking by themselves, of reports writing themselves in her handwriting. When she died 2 years later, her estate contained only one unfinished manuscript. Its title, "The Lie That Won the War." Inside it, she wrote, "The true danger of deception is not that others will believe it. It's that we will." Her words were prophetic. By the 1960s, the global information war she had helped birth consumed nations. From Washington to Moscow, truth became a matter of political convenience. Every government now operated its own phantom circuit, manipulating its citizens with the same precision once reserved for enemy armies. The line between propaganda and journalism, intelligence and entertainment, blurred beyond recognition. In a secret CIA training lecture dated 1961, an instructor summarized it bluntly: "Reality is perception. Perception is power. Therefore, control perception." It was a philosophy that would define the Cold War, the media age, and eventually, the digital one. Decades later, as the files of the OSS were finally declassified, historians sifted through the fragments of Phantom Circuit. They found the original documents: Ritter's forged assessments, Chase's memos, Donovan's field notes. Together they formed not just a record of deception, but a mirror reflecting the evolution of modern truth. One historian wrote, "Phantom Circuit was not a wartime operation. It was the prototype for the world we now live in." The climax of this story isn't an explosion or a revelation, it's a quiet realization that the war never truly ended. It changed shape, hiding in headlines and speeches and screens. The OSS may have vanished, but its ghost still lingers in the algorithms and news feeds that decide what billions believe every day. Hans Ritter's false report was meant to mislead a single dictator. It ended up redefining how the entire world understands reality. That was the ultimate irony. The man who believed he was serving the truth became the father of the lie that outlived him. And the organization that defeated him inherited his disease: the inability to distinguish between what is true and what is useful. History in the end didn't punish them. It simply absorbed them. And so, as the 20th century marched on, the greatest deception of all remained unseen: that the age of disinformation had not begun with technology, it had begun with a typewriter, a man in Lisbon, and a single invisible decision made in a dimly lit room by men who thought they could control the truth. But truth, like war, always finds a way to strike back. By the time the century turned, the men and women who had built the OSS were long gone. Their offices had been demolished, their files scattered into archives, their names footnotes in the history of intelligence. Yet their shadow remained, diffused into every newsroom, every broadcast, every flickering screen that shaped how the modern world perceived itself. It began as an act of survival. It became the architecture of civilization. The same techniques that once misled dictators now guided democracies. Every government, every corporation, every ideology learned the same lesson. If you control the story, you control the world. But what happens when everyone tells their own story, and no one believes anyone else's? That was the final question the OSS never asked. In 1991, a historian named Michael Carmichael discovered a sealed folder in the National Archives labeled PC/1944 Phantom Circuit. Inside were transcripts of radio intercepts, forged German reports, and a short post-war reflection written in Eleanor Chase's hand. It was dated 1946, never sent, never published. The handwriting was neat, fragile, fading at the edges. She wrote, "Every lie we told was meant to end a war. But wars do not end, they evolve. Deception is like radiation. It lingers long after the blast. We thought we could use illusion as a weapon, but in time, illusion used us. We began to see the world not as it was, but as we needed it to be. That is the price of victory." Carmichael included those lines in a lecture years later, pausing before the final sentence. "That," he said, "is the moment modern intelligence stopped being about knowing the truth, and became about deciding it." For the veterans who had survived the OSS, their legacy was a paradox. They had saved millions by tricking a dictator, but in doing so, they had proved that truth could be engineered. And once engineered, it could be sold. In the decades that followed, governments, advertisers, and technologists all borrowed the same language, the same frameworks. They didn't call it deception anymore. They called it perception management, strategic influence, information operations. The words softened, but the meaning stayed the same. Truth had become a commodity measured not by accuracy but by reach. If the OSS had invented the weapon, the modern world had perfected it. When the Berlin Wall fell, a new kind of war began, not between nations but between narratives. The Cold War had proven one final principle of Phantom Circuit. People will endure hardship, even tyranny, but not confusion. If you can make them doubt everything, you can control them completely. It was the same insight Hans Ritter had embodied without ever understanding it. He didn't fail because he lied. He failed because he believed. Decades after his death, historians reconstructed his final months through letters found in a Swiss bank vault. One, written to a woman in Hamburg, revealed the fragile humanity behind the spy. "I thought I was helping my country see clearly," he wrote. "Now I realize I only helped it go blind." His words, like Chase's, echoed the same truth. No one escapes their own illusion. When the Cold War ended, the archives of deception opened. Journalists unearthed stories that blurred the line between fiction and fact. Plots, coups, revolutions, all birthed from invisible pens. The world looked back at the OSS and saw not a relic but a mirror. Because the machinery they built never died. It evolved. It adapted to television, then to satellites, then to the endless glow of digital screens. Where once a lie had to be typed, now it could be shared in an instant. The Phantom Circuit had become literal, an invisible network pulsing across the globe, feeding billions of minds every second. And yet, the logic remained unchanged. Control the frame and the picture paints itself. A researcher once compared the OSS archives to the DNA of modern propaganda. Every psychological algorithm, every media campaign, every influence operation, traced its lineage back to those rooms in Washington where men and women learned to fabricate belief. The historian wrote, "What began as a secret became the blueprint of our civilization." But there was something deeper, something the archives could never capture. It wasn't about politics or power or even truth. It was about the human need to believe in something, to find coherence in chaos. The OSS had understood that instinct better than anyone. They had weaponized hope. And in doing so, they revealed a secret more terrifying than any weapon: that belief itself is fragile. Break it enough times and people will stop seeking truth altogether. That was the true legacy of the Phantom Report. It wasn't just that it fooled the enemy. It showed humanity that truth could be manufactured, manipulated, reassembled, and once that realization took hold, no society could ever truly trust again. The historian Carmichael once stood before his students and asked, "If every side in every war believes they're telling the truth, then who is lying?" After a long silence, he answered his own question, "Everyone. And no one." Because truth no longer matters once everyone builds their own. Somewhere deep in the archives, the original copy of Ritter's Forged Intelligence still sits, preserved in glass. Its typewritten lines are faded, the paper yellowing at the edges. But if you look closely, the imprint of the keys still dents the fibers, evidence of a human hand pressing belief into existence. Beneath it lies a note handwritten by an unknown archivist decades later. It says, "This document helped win a war. And then it started another." That anonymous archivist was right. The war for truth never ended. It only changed its uniforms: spies replaced by broadcasters, couriers replaced by algorithms, codes replaced by slogans. The methods evolved. The purpose remained. And yet, perhaps there is a faint redemption hidden in that darkness. The same human capacity that makes deception possible also gives rise to art, to storytelling, to empathy. The lie that wins a war can also teach a generation why wars begin. In that paradox lies the hope that one day humanity might learn to see truth not as a weapon, but as a fragile, shared inheritance. When future historians study the 21st century, they may trace the origins of disinformation, propaganda, and perception warfare back to the night of June 3, 1944. The night a man named Hans Ritter stepped off a plane in Lisbon with a briefcase full of lies he thought were true. They'll see in that moment the birth of a new age, the age when humanity discovered that reality itself could be rewritten. And if they listen closely, they might still hear the echo of that first transmission, the signal that began it all. The package breathes. It still does. Because the package was never a man or a report or a mission. It was us. Our faith. Our hunger to believe. That is the true phantom that haunts history, not the spies or the agencies, not the secrets or the wars, but the eternal question lingering in the dark. What do we believe when we can no longer trust what's true? And in that silence, somewhere between the last key struck and the last lie told, the world finally understands the cost of its own victory.